to my mind, it's a very clear cause and effect. What is causing the chronic kidney disease is high glucose levels and, the hyperinsulinemia and, all these things that come with it. For some reason, it's not so clear to many nephrologists that I talk to. To them, it's a mystery. To me, diabetic chronic kidney disease is actually not really a disease. It's more of a toxicity.
Welcome to the Plant-Free MD podcast with Dr. Anthony Chaffee, where we discuss diet and nutrition and how this affects health and chronic disease, and show you how you can use this to optimize your health and happiness, both mentally and physically. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Plant-Free MD podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Chaffee, and today I have a very special guest, Professor Thomas Weimbs from UC Santa Barbara, who is an expert on kidney disease and function. So a bit about Professor Weimbs. He's a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he directs a research laboratory focused on polycystic kidney disease, PKD, and received his doctoral degree from the University of Cologne in Germany, and then conducted postdoctoral research at the University of California in San Francisco. Professor Weimbs, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to see you again.
It's great to be here, Anthony.
Great. So for those who haven't come across your work and don't know too much about it, can you tell us a bit about your research and what you do down at UCSB?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as you mentioned, so my research focus has been on polycystic kidney disease for quite some time, so probably 20 plus years or so. And what is polycystic kidney disease? It's a genetic disease. It's essentially a genetic form of chronic kidney disease. And as you probably know, your listeners know, chronic kidney disease is very, very common. So chronic kidney disease, or CKD, affects something like 10% of the population. So it's extremely common, and most forms of chronic kidney disease are, of course, caused by type 2 diabetes, but there's also a small fraction, like 2% or so, that's caused by genetic diseases, and the most prominent of those is polycystic kidney disease, or PKD. So people with PKD, they develop the disease, and we've been studying this. There's not really any satisfactory treatment available. So for many years we have looked at molecular mechanisms underlying the disease, and trying to find out the next new drug target that we could go after. And I'm sure we're going to get into this. So we have actually stumbled on something completely different, where we have seen much better efficacy, and that has to do with dietary interventions as opposed to pharmacological interventions. So that has kept us busy in my research lab. So obviously I direct a research lab at the university, in addition to teaching and so on. And we also launched a company, just a few short years ago, based on these dietary research findings. And we can go into all of that as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, that would be the traditional method, would be treating this pharmacologically. Have you found, or has there been much in the way of pharmacological interventions for PKD, or is it pretty barren at the moment?
Yeah, it's pretty barren. There's exactly one approved drug in the US, and essentially worldwide. So one drug is out there. This drug is better than zero drugs, of course, but it's it does not stop the progression of the disease, let alone improve anything. So patients, even on the drugs, they still progress eventually to kidney failure. The drug might buy them a little bit of time. Unfortunately, the drug comes with toxicities and side effects. So there's kind of a trade-off there. There's liver toxicity, for example. Patients have to be monitored pretty closely when they're on that drug. The drug also induces polyuria, which means the patients, they're very, very thirsty. They drink something like 10 liters of water a day or so, and which means you also have to pee out 10 liters of pee a day. which means they have to go to the bathroom, pretty much every hour or so, essentially, day and night. So it's a big impact on their lifestyle, and it's just not compatible with many careers and professions and so on. But imagine you're an airline pilot or something and have to go to the bathroom every hour. I don't think that would work.
Yeah.
So it's, I think everybody would agree that there is room for improvement with managing the disease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what were some of the dietary interventions that you found, and how did you find them to be effective?
Yeah, so this came about. So we had been working for many years on the mTOR pathway, which I'm sure you know all about. That's one of these signaling pathways that is partially regulated by by growth factors, but also regulated by the nutrient status of cells. Or actually, this was a bit of a chance discovery. So I had a grad student in my lab who was working on the mTOR regulation and how it might drive polycystic kidney disease, and how we might be able to trick the cells into doing better things. And he reasoned that if you just feed the mice with polycystic kidney disease, if you just feed them less food, that might affect the nutrient status of these cyst cells in the kidneys, and might decrease mTOR activity and slow down disease progression. So that's not something that I would have thought would work. Seemed too simplistic for me, and luckily my student didn't ask me; he just did it. So sometimes there's it's good to be like at arm's length to your students and let them do their thing. So he did the experiment. He essentially put these mice with polycystic kidney disease on a restricted diet, with restricted food intake, only something like 23% less food intake. Okay. Which is, kind of a very mild restriction, and it didn't cause any change in body weight gain or anything like that. The mice were very happy and healthy. And it turns out the only thing that was different was that their polycystic kidneys did not progress. So the kidneys stayed smaller, looked much better, much healthier. And we could also see that there was a decrease in mTOR activity as planned. So that was good. But essentially, we published the paper saying that this works, and we don't really know why it works. So that was kind of the first publication that came out, where we just said food restriction somehow is beneficial in polycystic kidney disease, at least in a mouse model. And then, of course, we started to figure out what's actually going on there mechanistically. And one key observation was that the mice on the food-restricted regimen changed their feeding behavior quite dramatically. And the way that these caloric restriction, people call them caloric restriction experiments, the way that they have been done for many years is, you have your control group of mice that is ad libitum fed. So they essentially have food available all day long, all night long. And you measure how much the control group eats in a week or in a day. And then you put a pre-weighed amount of food into the cage of your experimental animals that is, minus 23%, let's say. But the difference is, in that case, they don't have a mountain of food in front of them all day long. They only get once a day a pre-weighed amount of food, and that actually completely changes the mouse's perception of life. They think, oh, food is restricted here. I better eat it all before somebody takes it away from me. And they essentially consume all their food within about an hour or so, and then which means for the remaining 23 hours they are fasting, which actually means that in addition to restricting the calories, you also push them into ketosis for like a long stretch of the day. So for about 12 hours, they're actually in ketosis, producing BHB, And I think that is actually turns out to be the key. So once we realized that, we used other methods of putting mice into ketosis, high fat, low carb, ketogenic diet, even acute fasting. And all these worked great. Ketogenic diet was actually very, very potent in stopping disease progression. In fact, it was so potent that it not only stopped disease progression, but it actually partially reversed the disease. So the existing cystic disease, reverted, which we had to almost de-emphasize in the paper because reviewers wouldn't believe it. Because it had never been seen at that time that you could possibly reverse something like polycystic kidney disease. And then one other sort of interesting experiment was, again, that I wouldn't have thought would work is to just supplement a beta-hydroxybutyrate, the main ketone that is made by the liver during ketosis, but just supplementing it in the drinking water, on top of just a regular high-carb rodent chow. Again, there wasn't something, okay, in this case, I think I said, okay, let's try it. Why not? But I had no hopes that this would do anything, but it did. It essentially replicated the beneficial effects of like a ketogenic diet in these mice without restricting their diet or changing the diet at all. So that was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, I suppose that's how you sort of came to the realization that BHB was a pretty key factor in this disease process. Do you know by which mechanism it would be that influenced it?
Yeah, so that's a big question that we've been trying to address. We published this paper essentially saying, okay, BHB clearly has something to do with it. We still don't know what the mechanism exactly is. And I actually got an NIH grant to figure that one out. So we've been working on this for quite a while. And as you well know, BHB number one is a molecule that is burned for energy, instead of glucose, and kind of takes that over. But it also is a signaling molecule. So it has functions that are essentially independent of its metabolic function. It has its own receptor. That's a G protein coupled receptor called GPR109A, which is in the literature not really known to be it is of course clearly known to be a BHB receptor, but it's not on the forefront of people's minds that there's actually a receptor. It's called the niacin receptor because that's how it was initially discovered. So it happens to bind to mega doses of this vitamin. But that is not the normal function of it. The normal function is to actually bind to beta-hydroxybutyrate under ketosis levels and then signal intracellularly. So that receptor has been one on our list of targets that we've been investigating. But BHB also, of course, has anti-inflammatory properties. It inhibits the NLRP3 inflammasome and thereby inhibiting many types of immune cells, for example. I think that is high on my list as well, because chronic inflammation is pretty much a ubiquitous feature in all forms of chronic kidney disease, including polycystic kidney disease. So we actually have data. I would say at this point, it looks like it's all of the above that BHB is doing. So we have mice in which this receptor is knocked out. So the GPR109A is knocked out, and so it's in the context of polycystic kidney disease. So these mice have polycystic kidney disease, but they're lacking the receptor, which means if BHB acts through that receptor, they should be resistant to treatment at that point. And in fact, they are, at least partially. There's still a bit of a beneficial effect, but it goes way down. So we think that the receptor clearly plays a role there. But we also see very strong anti-inflammatory effects in those kidneys with BHB treatment. And we're very interested to figure out what exactly are the immune cell populations that are most affected. We have some very new discoveries where we find a role of neutrophils in progressing PKD, which is not something that had been seen before. So we're very interested in that, and clearly BHB inhibits those guys quite potently as well.
Yeah, very good. And so when you said that this could reverse some of the cysts and in polycystic kidney disease, to what extent? How much have you reduced down the affliction?
Yeah, good question. So it's it doesn't go all the way back to a normal kidney. I think that would be asking too much. But we do see sort of like a improvement in not only in cystic burden. So we can measure essentially the cystic index, we call it. So that goes down, and it depends a little bit when the intervention kicks in. If you start it early, the effect seems to be greater. And the later you start, the less of an effect you get. And I think that has to do with the kind of the ongoing fibrosis, because these cysts essentially cause tissue damage, and then the kidney reacts by, inducing fibrosis there. And, it's difficult to reverse things once they're fibrotic. We do see improvements in fibrosis, but my hunch is that, once, you're very far along with highly fibrotic kidneys, there's only so much you can do. So earlier seems to be a better way of going about it.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, for people that don't know, maybe they could probably look it up. Maybe we'll get a picture of it. But polycystic kidneys they're generally massive. These have cysts, and they grow up from a little tiny kidney to then this big monster bloated kidney that typically doesn't work very well. And these people are quite unwell. I don't treat this normally, but I've had patients that have come in for other issues who have had polycystic kidney disease, and they're quite unwell in general. They seem to have a lot of metabolic issues, and they also age faster. I just noticed that a lot of times that there's someone who's my age, but they look 20, 30 years older than me, and they have, and then I find out they have polycystic kidney disease, and it's like, okay, well that sort of explains that then. It's not that that they're doing horrible things to themselves. It's just horrible things are being done to them by this disease process. But it's is it something that is still in the preclinical phase, or has there any been work done in human trials as well? Hey guys, just want to take a second to thank our sponsor, Carnivore Bar. I don't promote many products because honestly, all you need to be healthy is to just eat meat. For those times that you're out hiking, road tripping, or stuck at work and you want a nutritious snack that is just meat, fat, and salt if you want it, the Carnivore Bar is a great option. So I like this product not because it's just pure meat, but also because I want the carnivore market to thrive as well. And the more we support meat-only products, the more meat-only products there will be available in the mainstream. So if this sounds like something you'd like to get behind, check it out using my discount code Anthony to get 10% off, which also applies to subscriptions, giving you 25% off total. All right, thanks guys.
Yeah, so there are already trials that have been done, and many more that are in the pipeline and have started even. So one thing we had done early on, actually during COVID times, when suddenly I had, the lab was essentially shut down. We couldn't do any more animal experiments. And the researchers in the lab were kind of sitting around with nothing to do. And I happened to have a nephrologist in my lab who was doing his fellowship research in my lab. Terrific guy, Sebastian Strubel, out of Germany, which is where I'm from as well. So he spent, the plan was to spend a couple of years in my lab and do a lot of mouse experiments, and COVID hit right at that time. And then I suggested, okay, you're a nephrologist. why don't we see if people with polycystic kidney disease, which is, a fairly common disease, there's about 600,000 people with PKD in the US. And one would think that amongst a large number of people with a disease, there's a decent number that might have done a certain diet already, especially something popular like a ketogenic diet. So we were able to recruit over 130 patients with PKD that had already on their own experimented with ketogenic diets. But everyone had done their own version of it, of course, mostly kind of internet-based keto, and mostly for weight loss and so on. But we found these people and did a retrospective analysis of how they did with it. So the average duration was 6 months, and we had like a long questionnaire, that was went over with phone interviews and so on about the experience, and but also their essentially their labs. We got them from the doctors to look at things like kidney function, right? So what's called eGFR, the estimated glomerular filtration rate, which is a sort of a measure of the kidney function. And we found, interestingly enough, that not only did those patients actually report that they felt much better, but also their pain levels went down. And pain is a sort of a common complication in polycystic kidney disease. Sometimes they call it kidney pain, and oftentimes it has to do with just simply the compression of everything in the abdomen due to these very large kidneys. Sometimes it seems that the kidneys inherently actually cause pain just on their own. So there was really good improvements with that. But strikingly, there was improvement in hypertension. So hypertension is very common in PKD. So that went down. And kidney function actually improved statistically significantly in those patients, which seemed a bit of a miracle. Of course, there are many caveats to a study like this. So this is kind of self-reported data. A self-selected group of patients, that essentially volunteer to provide their data. It is possible that many others might have done a ketogenic diet and it didn't work for them, and they never raised their hand to say, I want to be part of the study. So, of course, there are caveats. But at least this looked very promising. So we published this study back then. And then at the same time, we had already worked with our friends and collaborators at the University of Cologne in Germany. So we have a long-standing collaboration with them. They happen to be, I would say, one of the top polycystic kidney disease research groups there, and clinicians there. And we had then put together a clinical trial protocol for prospective randomized control study. Took a while to get funding for it. Strangely enough, even a patient advocacy organization that you'd think there should be all over it. First the grant bounced, and then we had to resubmit it. And a year goes by with for no good reason, but eventually got funded. The study started and has been completed already and was published at the end of last year. So this was a randomized controlled study with people with polycystic kidney disease. They were divided into 3 arms: control arm, so no change in diet, a ketogenic diet arm, and a water fasting arm, so kind of like periodic water fasting. And the intervention was for 3 months, so very short term. It was really designed only as a pilot trial, not with efficacy as a primary outcome, but essentially looking at safety, feasibility, and so on. And so it turns out, safety and feasibility were no problem. Those patients are actually really motivated and they want to do something about their disease. So that all looked great. But surprisingly, there was even an efficacy signal already, even after 3 months. So especially in the ketogenic diet group, or I would say actually only in the ketogenic diet group. So in the keto group, there was a statistically significant increase in kidney function. So not only, like no decrease, but actually an increase, which is again, that is against the dogma. The dogma is that polycystic kidney disease is irreversible, only goes worse over time. So in this case, there was an increase. And so initially, we've, the standard way of measuring kidney function is by looking at the creatinine level in the blood. If kidneys stop working, it goes up, and you can calculate with a formula what the kidney function will be. Of course, the criticism is that creatinine is, influenced by the diet and by muscle mass and so on. So the initial comments we got back from reviewers was, "Oh, this means nothing. This is just because the diet change and so on." But luckily, then we also measured another marker called cystatin C, which is also a marker of kidney function that is actually independent of muscle mass, independent of dietary changes, meat intake, and so on. And this one showed the same increase in kidney function, which was great. And we also looked at what's called total kidney volume. So all the patients got MRI scans of their kidneys, and you can calculate the total volume of those kidneys as an indicator of progression. There was in the initial study, there was a non-significant decrease in total kidney volume. So the kidneys seem to have shrunk a little bit. It just missed statistical significance. But in a post hoc analysis that was recently done and presented at a conference, where we looked at patients with kind of sort of a constant ketosis. So kicking out a few patients that had only sort of like intermittent ketosis. If you look at those with robust levels of ketosis, there was actually a statistically significant decrease in total kidney volume. So again, going against the grain, and most nephrologists have a hard time wrapping their head around this. Mm-hmm. But the data is the data, I would say. Mm-hmm. So this looked great. And since then, we have a whole pipeline of clinical trials that we have been planning, and one of them has started. And then those trials, however, are through through this startup company that I mentioned, Santa Barbara Nutrients. So it's a company out of the university where I'm currently the chief scientific officer, and we have a terrific team of professionals in there. In fact, something like 10 people on the team have polycystic kidney disease themselves. So everyone is kind of in it for really good reasons, I would say. The funders of the company, the angel investors, all of them have polycystic kidney disease, or their family are affected by it. And we've come up with this a product which is a medical food called Ketocitra, that contains exogenous beta-hydroxybutyrate. So similar to what we gave to the rats and so on. We're testing now the potential efficacy of this product. We cannot call it efficacy because it's not a drug. So only drugs can be efficacious. So forget I mentioned that. It's actually labeled as what's called a medical food in the US. As you know, the FDA regulates foods and drugs. They also regulate supplements, and there's one more niche category called medical foods that most people had never heard of before, and neither had I. Before we got into all this. And medical foods are essentially foods, so they have to be safe, what's called generally recognized as safe. The ingredients have to be essentially approved food ingredients, which all of those are. So that's what the product is, and we're testing it in numerous clinical trials now. One has just started in Tokyo, in Japan, at Juntendo University, that's led by Professor Shigo Horie. There, looking at 100 patients in the intervention group and 100 controls, all with polycystic kidney disease. And the intervention is essentially this medical food, ketocetra, in addition to dietary changes, so ketogenic dietary changes. And that's a 1-year study, so 1-year intervention. So, it just started a few months ago, so it's going to be a while until we have some data. And we have essentially a duplicate study planned in Toronto at the University of Toronto with Dr. Yope, looking at 40 patients intervention and 40 controls with essentially the same study protocol. Fingers crossed it will hopefully start sometime soon. It's been delayed quite a bit, so I was hoping to already have some data there. And then we have, several other studies, one with the Cleveland Clinic, that would be a short-term study looking at metabolic outcomes. We're planning a study with Johns Hopkins University, with sort of a slimmed-down version, looking at this medical food ketocetra plus sort of a low-carb diet, so not ketogenic, but just like a lower-carb diet. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a whole bunch of studies. So planning one with University of Vienna in Austria, looking at kidney stone risk and so on. So so there's currently a lot going on. University of Southern California, there we actually put together something that I think was a really nice study. A 2-year trial looking at only this medical food ketocetra compared to standard of care. So essentially no other intervention, just only adding this medical food, which is sort of the study that all my nephrologist colleagues, that I talk to, they're screaming to hear that. So they want to know, forget about diet change. I don't want to do that with my patients. I just only want to give them something such as a medical food. So we put that study protocol together and actually submitted it to the NIH as the National Institutes of Health here for funding. And it got a great review. As you may know, the NIH, the first step is always the peer review. They have independent peer review panels, and those guys really liked the study. They said that's exactly what's needed right now. Great study design, great investigative team, and they recommended it for funding. So it got a good score and was percentiled with a percentile that is normally easily fundable. Funnily, in the second round, the second step during the NIH review is then the institutional review, where the top brass of the NIH looks at all the grants that were recommended for funding, and they have a bit of wiggle room to say, oh, we want to pull out this study that wasn't recommended for funding. We want to fund it anyway, or the other way around. And what they did is they declined funding for the study, interestingly enough. And so against the recommendation of the peer review panel, they said, no, we don't want to fund it. So we try to find out what were the reasons. And one of the main officially stated reason was that the effect size we have been seeing is too good. So interestingly, if something works really well, that means you shouldn't study it. Strangely enough, so that was the reason. So they said essentially, oh, nobody has ever seen such an effect size in any pharmacological study or anything else in polycystic kidney disease. Therefore, this can't be right. That can't be true. Or I don't know if they're doubting the data. It's peer-reviewed, published data in a really top journal. So the conclusion was, we're not interested in funding this. We can speculate what the reasons really are, but we're just going to try again and then resubmit it again. I think a second time they're not going to be able to deny it with a silly reason like that, I think.
Yeah, that's that is a bit odd. That's too good to be true, therefore it can't be. Well,
right.
I mean, doesn't it behoove an institution like the NIH to actually chase those up? You see some big example, like, okay, well, let's see what happens. And instead of saying couldn't possibly be right, well, you don't know. That's why we're doing studies. We're trying to find out, is that the case or is it not the case?
Exactly.
And so yeah, that's very strange that they denied that. I wonder if there's anything else going on that, again, because no pharmacological methods have ever shown this efficacy, and because there's no money on the other side, if these people had ties to industry and things like that, could that be influencing things? You have to sort of wonder. Unfortunately, you hope that it's not the case, but you have to sort of deal with history and human nature is that's happened in the past. It will probably happen in the future.
Yeah. It's hard to speculate, but I mean, in a sense, if something like a ketogenic diet approach and exogenous ketones, if that essentially is the most effective treatment one can possibly come up with, that also means that the pharmaceutical industries, there's actually maybe like about a dozen companies out there that are currently developing drugs for PKD. They have their pipelines, and everyone is going after their favorite target. That might wipe all of that out, right? So if there is a very inexpensive treatment that is so effective that no drug could ever reach it, I think all these companies will put one and one together and say, whoa, we don't want to sink any more money into it. So it's a consideration that essentially pharmacological research will stop. If a study like this would prove that this actually works as well as we think it does.
Yeah, which would be fine. I mean, the thing is too, is that they can then direct that money into something useful, and we can actually help.
I agree. I agree. To me, that's fine as well. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yes. It's of course always possible that Big Pharma sends a death squad to my house at one point, but we hope that won't happen.
Hopefully not. Yeah. It's I suppose I can see from your clinician colleagues' point of view that it is a lot easier to just prescribe a medication. Someone comes in with a problem, you have this, here's a medication, or a meal. You need to eat these foods, and this will help you. That is a lot easier than talking about diet and lifestyle. But I find that for me in my practice anyway, taking that extra time, 45-minute consultation, sometimes an hour, going through things thoroughly, and you lay the groundwork and you just explain to them why their blood markers are off and why their health issues are the way they are, and you relate that back to food and insulin resistance and all these other sorts of things. And that is really powerful for them. And you don't have to do that every time. You just have to lay the groundwork properly and give them resources that they can look at on their own. They're very they're very motivated, like you said. People with PKD, they really want something that works, and there really isn't anything. So they can't really be cavalier about it doesn't really matter, because it does matter, and they don't have things that can really help them and save them if they let things go too far. And so they're very highly motivated, and they want to get better. And you explain to them that this can help, and that this is a pretty straightforward way of doing it, and this is why this works, or to our best of understanding why this works. I find that I have very high compliance, very, very, very high compliance.
Right.
And so, I
Yeah.
think I think we're selling ourselves short as clinicians on how effective this can be and how effective we can be. And, most people have 10 minutes per patient, but if you account for that longer initial visit,
Mm.
you can, make up for it later on.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I have many dear colleagues in the nephrology circles, and many friends and so on. But I think one of the first impulse reactions I usually get is, oh, but no patient of mine could ever stick to a diet anyway. So they wouldn't even want to try. So I usually ask them, have you tried it? Because in my experience, there's a huge motivation, especially people with a genetic disease like polycystic kidney disease. So they have typically seen, one of their parents or grandparents, aunts and uncles, and so on, go through the same disease progression, and they might have lost their kidney function, might have been on dialysis, and maybe died on dialysis. So they all know what's coming. And they have it maybe graphically, sort of in their minds, what's coming. They want to do something about it, and they're actually very educated. So I've had a Facebook group of my lab for many years, and initially I just set it up, for students and alumni to be in there, so we wouldn't lose track of each other. But turns out that lots and lots of people with PKD joined, and now it has I forget the number, like 3,500 people with PKD are part of the group, and there's lots of lively discussions. People say, "Hey, have you seen this paper yet?" And they're discussing it, and everybody discusses diets and so on. So those folks are really motivated to learn something and do something about their disease. And most of those folks in those discussions say that they essentially get no support from their nephrologists. If it comes to diet, they're getting kind of brushed off, essentially, unfortunately. And part of it probably also has to do with sort of a fear amongst doctors not to do anything that is not FDA approved or not in a guideline, right? So it has to be one of those two things. Either it's approved by the FDA, then if something goes wrong, they can just blame the FDA, or it has to be in a guideline. So if something goes wrong, you blame the guideline. If it's neither, they're very, very uncomfortable. And I think many nephrologists actually think it is somehow illegal to do something that's not FDA approved or in any guideline. I mean, it almost doesn't matter what I say to them. That's just how they're trained, maybe educated, and maybe it has to do with medical malpractice fears and so on, that their insurance wouldn't kick in, if something goes wrong there. You're a practicing doctor. You probably have much more insight there. What the motivations are, to stay away from anything that's not approved or not in a guideline.
Yeah, well, it's CYA medical practice, cover your ass when practicing, and so and that's fine. What the guidelines are, and the guidelines. We talk about how we want evidence-based medicine, right? We want to practice medicine based on the evidence. This goes back to Hippocrates. Just do things that work. Don't just pray to the gods and things like that. Try something. If it works, keep doing it. If it doesn't, stop. And so that there was that. But so that's evidence-based. But a lot of the evidence comes from your own personal experience. You try something with your patients because of something, and you see that actually this helps and this works, and then you get this idea, and then you can publish studies and you can do all that sort of stuff. But it starts with what you're seeing. And if you try something, you do a ketogenic diet, someone hears this and tries a ketogenic diet with their polycystic kidney patients, and they find that it's making them worse, and they're like, okay, well, can we figure out something that's going on? Are they doing everything right? No, everything's fine. It's just getting worse. Fine, then you don't do it. It doesn't matter what a study says. But if you think, okay, well, maybe this can help, and it does help, then it also doesn't matter what any studies say, and it doesn't matter what any guidelines say. You can see with your own eyes what's happening to your patients, and that's really what matters. And sometimes you try a different drug with a patient and it doesn't really work. Well, it works with other people, so it has to work with them. Well, no, it doesn't. And you try a different drug, and then you try a different drug, and you try a different treatment, and you try all these different things. This is part of that. It doesn't hurt anybody. It's not harmful. It's not going to hurt them. So you're not doing any harm. And then you can see, does this help? And it doesn't matter what a study says after that. And so I think they'd be fully, protected. I mean, because they're not going to hurt anybody. But when we talk about the guideline medicine is, I mean, the guidelines are 10, 15 years behind the evidence. It takes a decade or more before the evidence of today that is commonly agreed upon in the medical establishment then gets into the guidelines. There's a lot of bureaucratic red tape that get in the way. And also they don't even look at the guidelines more than every several years. So it takes time. And, so practicing evidence-based medicine, well, this is what the evidence shows. We have randomized controlled trials. We have, retrospective analysis. We have preclinical, post-clinical data. Okay, well, let's give it a try on my patient population. See what happens. But, that's evidence-based medicine, but that's already 2 years behind the cutting edge because you had to have that idea and your grad student had to sort of do something behind your back before this even happens. Or someone had to, say, hey, let's try something. Let's try something new. And for something to be published in the literature, someone has to try it, and someone had to actually try this on real people. And so as a doctor, I read Atul Gawande, who wrote a book called Better. It's about how people had very different outcomes as doctors and how to get different things. And he was talking to a doctor that had some of the best results with cystic fibrosis in America, far above the average. And he was doing different things for his patients. And Dr. Gawande asked him, he said, hey, it's actually a lot of these things you're doing are, certainly on the guidelines, but they're, not really with the current literature and things like that. And he just sort of smiled and he just said, if you follow evidence-based medicine, you will always be 2 years behind the cutting edge. And so that's what he was doing. He was trying to advance our understanding of cystic fibrosis, not just, treat it as best we could right now. He was trying to make it better. And that's what you have to do. And so, and then if you're doing guideline-based medicine, I mean, that's 15 years behind the evidence. So, I mean, you're really far behind. But people do that because it's, they feel safe there. Instead of trying to advance our understanding, they're just trying to punch in their 9 to 5 and just go home without an issue.
Right.
You can understand that, but that's not necessarily the best thing for your patients. I've spoken to multiple people when they said they had colleagues in their department at whichever hospital they were working at, and one gentleman told me that his head of department was basically saying that he shouldn't use ketogenic approaches for his patients. And I actually believe he was a nephrologist, and he was saying, he's like, well, but this is the evidence. Is look at this study and look at this study and look at this study. And his head of department just said, yeah, I don't care what the evidence says. I don't practice evidence-based medicine. I practice guideline-based medicine. If it's not in the guidelines, I'm not going to do it. And it's like, okay. And typically I sort of think of the guidelines as a guideline. It's a guide. You say, if you don't have a clear direction to go in, if you don't have, the experience and acumen in your profession to say, this is what I think is the best way to go, you can at least use this as a guideline. This is sort of guide you in the right direction. And at least you're not going to make too massive of an error necessarily. And, for a head of department and someone who's, senior in their field, guideline-based medicine is probably a bit too circumspect. And you probably need to at least go with the evidence base. You don't have to necessarily push the cutting edge, but at least go with what the current evidence shows to do the best for the patient. Hey everyone, really happy to announce a new sponsor for the show and for everybody down in Australia, Stockman Steaks, who are delivering high quality grass-fed and finished pasture-raised beef and other meats, flash frozen and vacuum sealed to your door, something that I've been enjoying a lot of myself recently as well. They also have a great range of specialty items such as high-fat keto mince and carnivore beef and organs mince with liver, kidneys, and beef heart as well. So use code Chaffee today for a free order of beef mince or another specialty gift along with your order at stockmansteaks.com.au, and I'll see you over there. Thanks, guys.
Right. But it's also interesting, what is evidence? Strangely, I think a lot of the guideline writers, they're often, at least in the kidney field, they usually disregard things that are not randomized controlled, placebo-controlled, double-blind type of studies. So it's a drug studies, essentially, right? So if it's a drug study like this, it makes it into the guideline. If it's not, it doesn't. It actively gets suppressed. And as you all know, in nutrition, you cannot do anything placebo-controlled, obviously, right? Because your control group and your intervention group, they know what they're eating. So placebo control is already out the window. So you can essentially never reach that standard. Even randomization is very, very difficult in nutritional studies because the subjects know what they're eating, they know which group they're in, right? And nobody ever wants to be in the control group, right? Mm-hmm. So we have a hard time recruiting if we cannot fill the control group of anybody. And that is how drug trials, of course, work. You fool the patients, by giving them a placebo, so they have no clue which group they're in. That's the only reason why you can do those studies, right? Because you're fooling them. And it makes sense, for drugs, but it doesn't make sense for nutritional studies, right? So to have, to insist that it has to be randomized, controlled, and a placebo and double-blind, that's just not realistic, which means that any nutritional study will never reach that bar of a kind of an FDA proof a type of drug study. So it will never make it into guidelines, almost by definition. So it's, no, I agree. I think, doctors that are only thinking, I only do evidence-based things and only guideline-based things, they're inevitably will be behind the times. And, hopefully one of these days they'll get replaced by more adventurous folks that have more success with their patients.
Yeah, I think that's the most important evidence, is that what you try with your patients and what works. And so expert opinion is considered low down on the evidence hierarchy, but it's the most important thing for you in your practice and in your life. And if you're a patient and you're having this and you try certain medications and they do what they do, and then you try these different sort of therapies and they work much better for you, it doesn't really matter about the averages and the odds and the thises and the that's, and did this come to statistical significance? Because it came to statistical significance for you. It worked for you, and that's 100% of the patient population that is that we're concerned about here is what is happening to your body. And when my practice, and I think there's copious amounts of evidence to support the decision to try to change the way you're eating to affect changes in these myriad medical issues that we treat these days. And so I talk to my patients about that. I properly inform them, get informed consent, discuss what this means, and discuss how that can play a role in their health. And they agree to it, they want to do it, and they try it, and it works again and again and again and again and again and again. That's really the only thing that matters. Like, I've got, I'm on a hot, you found a winner, and you're just like, nope, we're just going to keep doing this. And I think that's the most important evidence for any individual clinician. And then, looking to publish some of my outcomes for my patients, case series and so forth. And Dr. David Unwin in the UK has done the same thing, and that's really helped as well. Now, it's not a randomized controlled trial. We definitely still need those to really prove this point, but it is evidence. And the only reason we're doing any studies is to try to see what works. But if you think, okay, well, I think this is safe, and we're going to see if it works for my patients, and it does work, well, that's all it comes down to. The study is just trying to help guide you and guide clinicians and guide patients to doing things that are of benefit for them. And if you try them and they're beneficial, then that's all that really matters at that point.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
So,
Yes.
I was just going to say, so, I mean, obviously your main field of expertise is in PKD, and you've seen kidney function improve for those patients. Do you know about other patients? This is a question that comes up all the time. And I've certainly come across papers saying that higher protein diets are actually good for kidney function. I've seen that in my practice. But what are your views on, higher protein, higher fat, ketogenic diets for normal kidney, like for people without PKD that may have chronic kidney disease?
Yeah, for sure. I think that the same strategy that I think works for PKD will work for essentially any form of chronic kidney disease. Maybe even especially, diabetic nephropathy, diabetic CKD, because there, to my mind, it's a very clear cause and effect. What is causing the chronic kidney disease is, the high glucose levels and, the hyperinsulinemia and, all these things that come with it. For some reason, it's not so clear to many nephrologists that I talk to. To them, it's a mystery why people with diabetes develop chronic kidney disease. Oftentimes they say, oh, we don't really know the mechanisms. And so it baffles me a little bit that's, that the, well, so let's put it that way. To me, diabetic chronic kidney disease is actually not really a disease. It's more of a toxicity, right? So a toxicity syndrome, right? So if you eat whatever lead-based paint chips off the floor all day long, as a doctor, what you would do is not, give some kind of a, something to take the pain away, but you tell the patient, oh, stop eating the lead-based paint chips, right? So you have to first take away the toxic, the reason for the toxicity. And that's, almost nobody thinks about that in the renal field, that diabetic nephropathy is actually caused by the diabetes. So first address the diabetes, get the blood glucose under control, and that is not a thing. Blows my mind why that is. Seems obvious to you and me and many others, but anyway, so yes, so I think obviously a ketogenic intervention is probably the most effective way of addressing type 2 diabetes, and that seems clear again to you and me, but not everybody else. So we actually published a couple of review articles recently over the last few months, kind of putting all the arguments together and, the clinical evidence together that actually says exactly that, that a low carb ketogenic approach, is likely to be the approach one should take first before adding drugs. You subtract essentially the toxicity there. One interesting almost proof of concept, if you will, is the SGLT2 inhibitors. But so that's the class of drugs that were initially developed for diabetes, and now they're actually being used for chronic kidney disease quite a bit. And nephrologists are really excited about them because for the first time in a long time, there are some drugs that actually seem to do something in chronic kidney disease. And what SGLT2 inhibitors do is they make the patient pee out glucose, right? So you lose something like 80 grams of sugar, by just peeing it out. And it leads to sort of a low level of ketosis. So nothing great. You don't get to like 2 millimolars of BHB or something. Right? It's a low level of ketosis, but there are ketones being produced. And there is already a mechanistic mouse study. In mice, you can do these mechanistic studies that you couldn't do in humans. That study came out maybe a couple of years ago that really nailed it down. I think that the renoprotective effect of SGLT2 inhibitors is actually due to the BHB being produced. So it seems clear, except nephrologists somehow still don't think that way. They think there's some mysterious actions of SGLT2 inhibitors that are some kind of weird off-target effects that somehow protect the kidney, and it probably couldn't have anything to do with the glucose, getting removed and ketones coming up. So that the logical conclusions somehow they don't seem to happen. But nevertheless, the drugs are popular. They're being used. They cost an arm and a leg, and you could probably achieve the exact same effect by telling a patient to consume 80 grams less carbohydrates per day. You'd have the same effect, very likely, for essentially no cost. So it's interesting that oftentimes a drug that actually does the right thing is still. Even though it comes like with all kinds of side effects, but that is easily accepted, especially if the mechanism is being kept murky and people are not actually told what's that it's just simply the glucose that is being lost there.
Yeah, it is interesting how we have all these medications that interrupt how your body uses or eliminates carbohydrates. You have other medications that stop you from absorbing as many carbohydrates in your gut, and this is used for diabetes, and then others that cause you to eliminate more glucose in your urine, and this is good for diabetes. And then we're thinking like, well, maybe we should restrict carbohydrates. Oh, no, hold on.
Right,
it's crazy.
Exactly. Yes, that's
right. Yeah, you have all these drugs that are doing that are restricting carbohydrates, and yet we don't restrict the carbohydrates. I saw a professional rugby player was on Instagram, and he was saying what he does before a big international test match, and as a type 1 diabetic, and he's saying that he needed his trainer or doctor, whoever, told him that he needed 5 grams of carbs per kilo of body weight, and so because of his weight, he was eating 550 grams of carbohydrates a day in order to maintain his energy levels and things like that as a type 1 diabetic. And so he's having to inject and use insulin.
That's
and things
crazy.
like that. I think so too.
Yeah.
And whereas all we're trying to do is actually reduce the amount of carbohydrates and use insulin and use drugs to just reduce this level down. And obviously the less carbohydrates you eat, the less insulin you need to use. And I've heard people that don't necessarily really understand this that well, that when you eat carbohydrates, then your blood sugar goes up, and then your insulin comes up, and that just drives energy into cells. It's a perfectly normal relationship. And it's like, yes, it is down here in normal levels, but when you're artificially jacking up your carbohydrate level and your blood sugar to extremely high levels that are well known to be physiologically damaging to the body, and your insulin is going up markedly to counteract that and get this into cells, that's abnormal, especially when people understand that insulin affects over 100 different mechanisms besides glucose regulation. And so you elevate it up to drive this energy into cells, and then it stays elevated, and it's affecting all these 100 other mechanisms in a very unbalanced sort of way. And so, I mean, we're getting worse and worse results with the advancements, so-called advancements of medicine and technology. And so obviously that can't be right.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And getting back to our interest in diabetic chronic kidney disease and what to do about it. So that's actually sort of like really high on our list of doing clinical trials on. I'm convinced the same approach will work really well there. And some folks like David Unwin you mentioned have essentially already shown it and published it. It's not being accepted very much in the establishment because this wasn't a randomized controlled trial. But I think clearly these folks improved their kidney function, which normally they don't. So we're trying to work with actually several different institutions and investigators to just give this a try. And I think that the beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketone actually itself has a beneficial effect. So even if you don't take away the toxicity, the high glucose levels, if you add essentially the beta hydroxybutyrate, I think it will do some good. If nothing else, it's probably the anti-inflammatory effects in the kidneys. So that's something we're very interested in trying out. Can we get some beneficial impact in diabetic nephropathy with even just as medical food, ketosetera? Ideally, with some kind of modest dietary changes, maybe I would say, where you at least cut out the worst offenders, you cut out the sugars, let's say, and, reduce starch intake, so to not go completely overboard. And at some point, it's also, of course, a question how scalable is something. So a hardcore keto carnivore diet, is probably the best way of doing it, but scalability is a problem, right? So if you're trying to turn like a subcontinent like India with 1 billion people into beef eaters, that's an uphill battle. So that will probably not happen in our lifetimes. So it's good to have some, kind of some tricks up the sleeve to actually help people that, for one reason or another, you just stick to their diet and, get rid of some of the worst things, the ultra processed foods and so on we could talk about. But it's, if you remove those and add something like an exogenous ketone, I think that might go a pretty long way already.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is too, is that my patients that come in, they're very highly motivated. The traditional sort of pills and potions and things like that, and going to their GP hasn't helped their situation. They haven't lost weight. They've tried eating less and moving more and taking medications and all these things, and they're not working, and they're feeling unwell, and they're getting steadily sicker. And so by the time they come to me, that's because it's all word of mouth. They see a family member or a friend that significantly improves their health, and they say, I want that. How did you do that? I said, well, I went to see this person, he put me on a program, and it really worked. So I have people coming in that are very receptive to these sorts of things. And so for me, I have about 100% of 100% of my patients that come in fresh, and then I can talk to them about this from the beginning, will at least try. And I can point out why that's significant and say, hey, in a couple of months when we check this, these will all change in these ways. And they do. And so I say, okay, well, this is clearly working, and it's working in the way that you said it would. And so they stick with it. There have been maybe 2 or 3 people that after they've done like a very strongly ketogenic carnivore diet, after a few weeks or a month, they just say, I don't know, can we open it up a bit, maybe ketogenic, but not full carnivore or these other sorts of things. I say, maybe we can eat some more things. And it's like, okay, well, you're diabetic and you have these issues. I really think you need to still be on a ketogenic diet. But we can add other things in there too, if that makes things easier for you. And they're like, yes, that would help. Invariably, every single one. It was only 2 or 3 people who did it in the first place, but each one of those people came back to me in a few weeks or a month or 2 and said, I think I need to go back onto the more strict version, because they were feeling so much better, and they were getting such better results. And so even though it felt restrictive at first, they actually really realized how much it was helping them. And they said, like, actually, that's probably something I can do, and I actually want to do it. But that's a very specific patient population. And a lot of people are not interested. Their health hasn't gotten to the point that they are saying, no, that's it. I'm going to fix it. Or they just don't care. Maybe their health is suffering and they're like, I don't care. There are people out there like that. And so, you still need to help them. You still need to have some sort of ability like, yeah, I'm not going to change that. I'm not going to cut out. Okay, fine. What else can we do? And so that's great that you're looking at other sorts of mechanisms like exogenous, BHB that can help them, because, any port in a storm. And if they're not willing to, do what I think is the best thing to do, at least at least we can do something for them.
Right. Yeah. I totally agree. Yes. There's also a few, some easy things that, things like oxalate, for example. So we've actually studied that in the lab and found that these calcium oxalate microcrystals, that form in kidney tubules and eventually can go on to form kidney stones, that they're extremely disruptive. They cause massive cell injury, massive inflammation, and actually accelerate polycystic kidney disease quite dramatically. So we can very easily make PKD worse in rats, by just giving them oxalate. Have also shown the same for calcium phosphate microcrystals, now also for uric acid microcrystals.
Okay.
And those are all these the substances that just don't want to be very soluble, and they give kidneys trouble. If you cut out those stressors, I think that already has quite an impact. And it's fairly straightforward to do it, even for oxalate. It's just a matter of awareness, which foods are, through the roof in the oxalate content. There's, a bunch of them, but they're easy to substitute. Same for phosphate, for example. Most of I would say the dietary burden of phosphate comes from these inorganic phosphate food additives, in ultra-processed foods and beverages and so on. If somebody is aware of it and learns how to read ingredient lists, you can very easily avoid those and just, do something good for the kidneys without essentially having to do anything dramatic with the diet.
Yeah. I didn't actually realize that you'd done experiments with oxalates as well. That's
Oh yeah, yes, yeah. So that's something we published pretty much at the same time when we published the ketogenic diet results. So that came about just essentially from a hypothesis, that I had come up with a long time ago, and I could never find anyone in the lab to actually want to do it until finally I found someone that said, all right, fine, if I have to, I'll do it. And everything worked immediately, really nicely, right? So it's so easy to do. You take some rats with polycystic kidney disease, you feed them oxalate or inject it, however you want to do it. You see these, the massive burden of calcium oxalate microcrystals in the kidneys popping up. It's very easy to detect. And then you see all these injury pathways lighting up like Christmas trees. Lots of the same pathways sort of get activated that are usually activated in polycystic kidney disease anyway. So it just makes things worse. You see all these immune cells coming in. Macrophages primarily. And if you then do the converse, and so the best antagonist, I would say, for calcium oxalate microcrystal in the kidney is citrate, citric acid, because citrate chelates calcium and it just prevents the formation of calcium oxalate. So essentially it allows the kidneys to excrete oxalate sort of harmlessly without causing damage. And that's actually the normal function of citrate in the kidney. So evolution has already thought about all this and actually excretes a certain level of citrate through the urine. And but it so happens that many people are hypocitraturic. Oops, excuse me. And especially in people with polycystic kidney disease, their urinary citrate levels are usually very, very low. So they're already at a much higher risk. So if you supplement with citrate, you can actually stop disease progression quite substantially. And so we've done this in rat models of PKD. So it is very, very effective. You just put some citrate into the drinking water. It raises the urinary citrate level. It also, you formulate it in a sort of an alkaline way, so it also raises the urinary pH. And all of this prevents calcium oxalate crystals from forming in the kidneys. And it greatly improves disease progression. That's actually the reason why there is citrate in this medical food product, Ketocitra. So that's kind of the second mechanism that we're addressing there. So it's number one, the ketosis with BHB, and number two, the microcrystals with the citrate. And we actually found that when we combine those two, BHB and citrate, we get a synergistic effect that allowed us to reduce the dose of both of those and then still get the full effect.
Okay. And so that's very interesting, because a lot of people obviously, contend with oxalate dumping and oxalate issues, especially coming from like a plant-based diet or on a plant-based diet. And there are different sorts of ideas on how to best treat that. But from what you're saying, if someone had this oxalate issue via from dumping or from just ingestion, that just taking citrate as a supplement could ameliorate that. Is that right?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, it would have to be so I would say alkaline citrate is the way to go, and that's essentially what's in Ketocitra. So it is, it raises the urine pH, which helps actually with the normal excretion of citrate, because citrate urinary excretion is controlled by the urine pH. If somebody has a very acidic urine pH, let's say you have pH 5, chances are you're also hypocitraturic, so you don't have a lot of citrate there. So raising the urinary citrate, the urinary pH is already beneficial, and then adding more citrate on top of that really pushes things over the edge. And I think that I would absolutely recommend this to anyone who has oxalate issues, to do that, to essentially allow the kidneys to just excrete much larger amounts of oxalate than it would normally could do. The other way of reducing dietary oxalate is, of course, by making sure there's calcium in the diet at the same time, because the calcium in the diet will bind to oxalate and prevent the uptake in the GI tract. And that's actually one of the main reason why there's calcium also in Ketocitra, so that people, even if they do have some oxalate in the diet, let's say they do end up eating a spinach salad or something, it essentially neutralizes the oxalate in there and prevents the uptake. So it's kind of a safety measure, if you will.
Okay. Is there any particular form of citrate that people should take, or is it anything available?
Yeah. So so the way we formulated Ketocitra is we spread out the cations. So citrate, alkaline citrate, the citrate is a base, and so you have to have something with it. And we're using a mix of calcium, magnesium, and potassium in there. So it's sodium free, and that's for good reason, because there is actually some solid data saying that excessive sodium intake actually worsens polycystic kidney disease. And I think it's I would guess it's actually less the absolute amount of sodium, and it's actually more the relative proportion between sodium and potassium. So potassium is actually very beneficial for kidneys, and it counteracts the sodium. So that's why we made Ketocitra sodium free. If somebody wants more sodium, that's the easiest thing in the world to add, of course. So usually what nephrologists would prescribe is typically potassium citrate, which, for my taste has a little bit too much potassium. If it's just the pure potassium citrate, I think this can cause even more some GI issues that you wouldn't necessarily have with this kind of a more balanced electrolyte version of it.
All right, very good. Well, I think the only other major question that I had is, with this sort of culture of wanting the randomized controlled placebo trials, it's not going to get in the guidelines, and looking for drug targets as opposed to just what actually works and underlying mechanisms. How do you see the future of this line of research with ketogenic diets and as an adjunct to treating these, or even as a primary way of treating these things? How do you see that building in the next few years? Is this are we sort of doing something futile here, or do you think this is going to catch on in the mainstream?
Yeah, I definitely think it's not futile, and it's great. It's almost comes out of a kind of a bit of a grassroots movement, right? So it's the crazy pioneers that are doing it right now, and but I think we all have. Especially people like you, right? So you're out there, and you're doing podcasts like this, and they reach lots and lots of people. So that is actually, I think, a very important, so almost like an educational component, because these things are not in textbooks yet, and probably won't be for quite a while, at least the standard medical textbooks. So I must say, I had never really heard much about ketogenic diet as a scientist, biochemist, cell biologist. I knew of course all the the underlying mechanism and so on. But when we first stumbled on this whole keto line of research in my lab, I try to educate myself, and it's completely useless to look at textbooks, because there's nothing in there. So I got actually I learned the most from people like you, and on YouTube and social media and podcasts and so on. I think that's currently where the real information is out there. But I think eventually it will make it. There's now so many clinical studies coming up with ketogenic metabolic therapy. So it's hundreds and hundreds that are listed on clinicaltrials.gov right now. They will all be published at some point, and it's going to be an avalanche of data and results coming out. I think, maybe I'm optimistic, but I think 10 years from now, that's when many doctors will start maybe using this as a first-line therapy. And maybe 20 or 30 years from now, that's when it will be regarded as medical malpractice not to offer this first to a patient. I hope we will get there at some point, but I'm pretty sure we will. The same happened with like lobotomies or something, like back in the days. That was the first thing you do. Oh, there's a misbehaving child with ADHD. You chop their brain in half and done. Now, of course, it's we can't imagine anyone would have ever done that, right? So I think the same will happen with ketogenic metabolic therapy. So we'll get there, and that's thanks to people like you. I think to a large extent educating even people like me that had never heard about it. So I think you're doing a great thing there.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And I'm certainly optimistic as well. I mean, having more professors and researchers such as yourself coming across this and saying, hey, look, there's actually some validity here, and when you study it, you find there's even more validity. I think that's very encouraging, and that more and more people are doing that. We've had some sneaky wins as well. The guidelines in Australia have actually changed to include ketogenic diets for the treatment of diabetes, and now it's actually considered best practice to treat diabetes with a ketogenic diet, which was actually the original treatment for diabetes. It was the only treatment we had for type 1 or type 2. and until we were able to manufacture insulin. But that was sort of sneaky because there was a Dr. James Mukey who's an ophthalmologist in Australia, and for his research and his charities in that realm, he got named Australian of the Year, I believe, in 2020, and so that was great. And so we had this sort of name and air about him, and so he was just invited just because of that to come on the board and help with the government guidelines for the treatment of diabetes. And he's like, okay, I mean, doesn't treat diabetes directly except for diabetic retinopathy. And, but he knew about ketogenic diets, and he was well aware of the literature and the studies that had been done showing that you could reverse type 2 diabetes, the publication from Verta Health and elsewhere. And so he really fought for it. And he said that there are people really fighting against him on that. And who knows, they may have had, pharmaceutical ties. They all do pretty much. And, but he really fought. He just really dug his heels in, and he was able to convince the rest of the board. And now it's in the guidelines. And so it's one of those things that it's probably going to take a lot longer than that for everywhere else, unless we get someone like an insider that really knows about this and doesn't have any conflicts that would make him not recommend this. But I think that's the foot in the door, and getting more studies out. Like you say, there's hundreds of studies in the works for ketogenic metabolic therapy in various conditions, and and there are thousands of other ones that have already been published. So they're just going to build and build and build. And if we continue having these conversations and getting the word out there, and people share and pass these things around to their friends with kidney issues or other sort of issues that could help, it just grows. And hopefully we sort of get to the point where this is just barn door obvious that this is the way to go. And that's my hope. That's not too far fetched, I don't think.
I totally agree. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so I would say keep doing the good work. So I think it's just fantastic. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking your time. It was great to meet you. We were at a conference together in Switzerland, which was fantastic. The Keto Live conference there. We both presented, and it was fantastic. And it was an absolute pleasure to meet you there. And it was great to be able to see you again and have you on the podcast. So thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Super. Thank you, Anthony. Great. See you soon.
Yeah. Oh, and just briefly, where can people find you, find your work, and potentially support your work as well?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Maybe the easiest way is to just go on Facebook and type in Weimbs Lab. So there's a whole group there. Anyone is welcome to join. It's a public open group. So anyone with an interest in keto for kidneys, let's say, there's lots of discussions there. People can also go to Santa Barbara Nutrients, our startup company. It's easy to Google, just Santa Barbara Nutrients. There's a mailing list and lots of information there, blog posts and so on. So that's probably the best ways. And of course, anyone can always shoot me an email. I'm easy to find, just weimbs@ucsb.edu, for example. I'm always open to interesting ideas and discussions and so on.
Right.
For sure.
Well, perfect. And I would definitely encourage anybody with kidney issues to go on that Facebook group and contribute and talk. And if you are new to this and you need some help and support, I'm sure there's plenty of people there that will be able to give you their experiences and help you along the way. And especially for people that have been doing ketogenic carnivore diets and similar, and it's great for them to get into the Facebook group too, to relay what their experiences have been, positive or negative, hopefully more positive than negative, but just to further our understanding of this and help people understand what to realistically expect from their kidney disease in certain circumstances. So I do encourage everyone to check that out and join there. And I will put the other links for Professor Weimbs in the description below. So thank you again, Thomas, for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Super. Thank you, Anthony.
No problem. Hey guys, thank you very much for taking the time out to listen to what I had to say. If you like it, then please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel and podcast. And if you're on YouTube, then please hit that little bell and subscribe, and that'll let you know anytime I have a new video out, which should be every week, if not more. And if you could share this with your friends, that would help me get the word out and let me know that you like what I'm doing. Thanks again, guys.